In a Michigan attic, a woman pries open a rusted metal box her grandfather left behind decades ago. Inside, faded paper stock certificates stamped Ford Motor Company, 1958. She has no idea what they're worth. Her grandfather worked the assembly line in Dearborn for 30 years. He never once mentioned owning a piece of the company he built cars for. By the end of this story, you'll understand how one paycheck decision made on a factory floor in the 1950s could quietly outgrow everything else a worker ever earned. But here's the twist. This fortune should not exist at all. In 2008, the very company behind that paper came within about $1 a share of being nearly worthless. So how did a stack of forgotten paper survive a crash that swallowed entire banks and end up worth more than an entire lifetime of factory wages combined? To find out, we have to go backward. Not forward from the beginning, but backward from what's sitting in that box today, toward the exact choice that started it. The certificate itself is dated 1958. But the story of Ford behind it, and how a line worker ended up owning part of the company, starts even earlier than that. Her grandfather's name is written on it, along with a number of shares. What she doesn't know yet is just how many times that number has multiplied since then. Ford stock has split multiple times since the 1950s, and paid out dividends for most of 7 decades. A handful of untouched shares can quietly compound into something enormous. A stock split doesn't cost the owner anything extra. The company simply divides each existing share into more shares, so a small original pile quietly multiplies in size every time it happens. Add to that dividends, the small regular payments a company makes to every shareholder just for holding on, and even a modest number of shares can snowball far beyond what anyone expects. By the time she brings the certificate to an advisor, the shares her grandfather bought with a single old bonus check are worth more than the house she grew up in. But an old paper certificate isn't cash. Before anything can be sold or transferred, the advisor first has to confirm with Ford's official transfer agent that the shares are still validly registered under her grandfather's name. A factory paycheck from decades ago, deducted a few dollars at a time, had turned into more money than most Americans earn across an entire working life today. That is the twist behind the story of Ford that almost nobody knows. Not the cars, not the factories, but what happened to the people who quietly held its stock. But before we get to how he got those shares, there's a harder question first. How did that paper survive the one single year Ford almost didn't make it through? That single year, more than any other, decided whether this whole family story would end in a life-changing fortune or in absolutely nothing at all. November 2008. Ford's stock price collapses to just over $1 a share. A company that survived the Great Depression is now one bad quarter from oblivion. 2 of Detroit's other giants, General Motors and Chrysler, run completely out of cash and take emergency government bailouts just to keep their doors open. Ford refuses the bailout entirely. 2 years earlier, it had quietly mortgaged nearly everything it owned: factories, its own headquarters, even its Blue Oval trademark, just to raise cash first. That gamble meant no government bailout, and no government ownership of Ford. But it also meant every ordinary shareholder was left holding the full weight of the risk alone. For the first time in decades, Ford stops paying dividends entirely in 2006. The payments don't resume again for 6 long, uncertain years. Anyone counting on old Ford shares for retirement income, including families who had never touched theirs in decades, suddenly gets nothing back at all for years. For anyone who did know they were holding old Ford stock that year, opening a monthly statement felt less like checking an investment and more like bracing for bad news every single time. If the family in that Michigan attic had panicked and sold that winter, the entire inheritance would have been worth almost nothing when the dust settled. But they didn't sell. They didn't even know the shares existed. And that ignorance, strange as it sounds, is exactly what ended up saving the fortune. By 2013, Ford's stock had climbed back many times over from that $1 low. Shares nobody remembered had quietly become the family's single biggest asset. To understand why nobody remembered those shares, we have to go back even further to the man who bought them, and the decades of silence that followed. He bought the shares in the 1950s. He never sold a single one. He also never talked about them, not to his wife, not to his own children. In the culture of a Detroit factory floor, that silence was normal. You didn't brag about savings. You just worked, and you let the paperwork sit in a drawer. In that era, a steady paycheck and a company pension were what security looked like. A stock certificate felt like an afterthought compared to the guaranteed retirement plan sitting right in front of him. He retires in the late 1980s. He dies in the 1990s. The shares pass quietly to his children, who don't fully understand what they've actually inherited. Paperwork gets filed away. A folder moves from one house to another. Somewhere in that shuffle, the shares simply stop being anyone's priority to check on. How many other drawers, in how many other houses, hold the same kind of forgotten paperwork right now? Nobody in this family ever set out to hide the shares. They simply stopped looking. Decades pass. The stock keeps splitting, keeps paying dividends when it can, and keeps quietly growing in the background of a life nobody is watching it in. It isn't until a granddaughter, cleaning out a house after another death in the family, finds that same box again, the one we opened at the very start. Now go back even further, to 1958, on an actual Ford assembly line in Dearborn, where this entire story began with one small, ordinary decision. Ford, like many big companies of the era, offers employees the chance to buy company stock directly through small payroll deductions taken from every paycheck. Most workers take the cash instead. Bills don't wait, and a bird in hand feels far safer than a stock certificate nobody in the family has ever owned before. This one worker decides differently. He signs the form instead of pocketing the extra pay, betting on a company he already trusts because he builds its cars daily. It isn't a huge sum at first. Just a few dozen shares, bought a little at a time, quietly deducted from paycheck after paycheck for years. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss what's next. He never touches those shares again. Not when the Mustang launches. Not when he retires. He simply lets them sit, the same shares his granddaughter would one day find. But why did Ford even offer stock to ordinary line workers in the first place? Just a couple of years earlier, that stock hadn't even existed for the public to buy at all. To understand that, we step back one more time, to a single week in January 1956 that changed everything about who could ever own a piece of Ford. For 53 years, Ford had been a private, family-controlled company. No stranger off the street could buy a single share of it, until that January morning. January 17, 1956. Ford Motor Company goes public for the first time in its history, and it instantly becomes the largest stock sale Wall Street has ever seen at that point. Buying stock in 1956 wasn't as simple as tapping a button on a phone. It meant standing in line at a bank, filling out paper forms by hand, and waiting weeks to find out if your application was even accepted. Shares are priced at $64.50 each. Hundreds of thousands of people apply to buy in, ordinary Americans, not just Wall Street insiders. Ford employees are given priority access to shares. The same people building the cars on the line are suddenly offered a chance to own part of the company itself. Reserving shares for employees first wasn't just generosity. Keeping loyal workers invested in the company's future was also a way of keeping the factory floor calm and cooperative for whatever came next. For the first time in Ford's history, a machinist and a millionaire can technically own the exact same thing, a single share of the same company. Some Ford employees hesitate completely. Owning stock still feels like something wealthy people do, not something a modest factory paycheck is supposed to buy into. Others sign up immediately, treating it less like an investment and more like proof that their years spent on the line actually meant something bigger. None of them know it yet, but that quiet decision, 5 minutes with a pen at a bank counter, would outlast the workers, their children, and even the cars they built. But the deeper question remains. Why did the Ford family, who had controlled every single share for 50 years, suddenly decide to sell any of it at all? The answer has nothing to do with needing money to build cars. It has everything to do with a death, and a tax bill nobody in the family could avoid. In 1943, Edsel Ford, Henry Ford's own son, dies suddenly and unexpectedly. Ownership of the company passes down through the family, and so does a massive inheritance tax bill. When a large privately held company passes to the next generation, the tax owed on that inheritance still has to be paid in real cash, whether or not the family actually has that cash sitting anywhere. The family's entire fortune is tied up in a company that isn't publicly traded, meaning there is no easy way to sell off a small piece to cover the tax. Selling the company outright was never an option the family would accept. Selling a portion of it to the public was the only path that let them keep control while still settling what was owed. The solution comes through the Ford Foundation, an existing charitable fund the family had set up years earlier. It now holds a massive block of company stock, slowly sold off to the public over the following years to help raise the needed cash. That 1956 public offering, the one that let a factory worker buy stock right alongside millionaires, only happens because of a tax problem inside one grieving family. Without Edsel Ford's sudden death, and the tax bill that followed it, there may never have been a way for an ordinary line worker to own a piece of Ford. A death none of them wanted led to a tax bill none of them could pay, which is the entire, unlikely reason a factory paycheck could ever become a fortune. The family in that Michigan attic never invested a single day of their lives. They just kept a box nobody ever threw away, and let decades of quiet growth do the rest. So, is there an old box, an old envelope, or an old account sitting somewhere in your own family that nobody has ever bothered to check? Tell us below.